Usually when you think of like a monumental military victory, you picture the victors securing their freedom and just dictating the terms of peace.
Yeah, completely reshaping the landscape.
Exactly. It's a clean, triumphant narrative.
Yeah.
But when you look at the Great Sioux War, and specifically the aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that clean narrative just totally shatters into this really jarring historical paradox.
Welcome back, by the way, to the third chair at our table. We are so glad you're here joining us.
Oh, absolutely. It's great to have you with us.
And real quick, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives. But yeah, jumping right in, today our mission is exploring an era we're calling the Starving Winter, hunted after Little Bighorn. We've been looking through a massive stack of historical documents, military reports, and chronologies.
And this specific era, it really forces you to rethink almost everything you assume about how wars are won and lost. Because in June of 1876, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne achieve what is arguably the most famous Native American triumph in the West, the Battle of the Greasy Grass.
Right.
Or Little Bighorn.
Right. They decisively defeated Lieutenant Colonel Custer and the 7th Cavalry.
Decisively. Yet, as we dive into this, we hit this wall of just devastating facts. By the spring of 1877, so less than a year after this overwhelming victory, many of those exact same victorious families were arriving at U.S. government agencies completely destitute.
Yeah, starving, freezing.
Just physically broken.
It is a really profound and rapid collapse. And I mean, to understand how the victors of the biggest Native American triumph in the West became desperate refugees so quickly, we have to look past the battlefield itself.
Right.
The outcome wasn't decided by a single glorious cavalry rematch. It was actually decided by this relentless, totally unsentimental military campaign directed against the very means of human survival.
But I'm trying to picture the immediate aftermath of Little Bighorn to understand how that shift started. Because in June 1876, you have this massive summer village.
Massive. The sources estimate there were 6,000 to 7,000 people camped together.
Which includes about 2,000 able-bodied warriors. Logistically, how is a city of 7,000 people moving across the plains even possible to sustain without modern agriculture?
Well, it isn't, and that right there is the central vulnerability that the U.S. military ended up exploiting. A nomadic hunter-gatherer society simply cannot keep an encampment of that size together indefinitely.
Especially as summer turns to fall, right?
Exactly. Think about the daily requirements. You need grazing for tens of thousands of horses.
Yeah.
You need firewood for thousands of family fires, and enough game to feed 7,000 mouths every single day. So they had to disperse. Traditionally, Native American bands would just split up into smaller family groups and hunker down in secluded river valleys to survive the harsh winter months.
And the U.S. military command, specifically Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan, he understood this ecological reality perfectly.
Precisely. Sheridan commanded the military division of the Missouri, and he had utilized winter campaigns successfully in the past, so he deliberately implemented that strategy here.
Because he knew the weather would do half the work.
Yeah, the military knew that harsh weather would immobilize the native camps. Deep snow would weaken the pony herds, making it basically impossible for the bands to move quickly, hunt effectively, or mount any kind of large counteroffensive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because a winter campaign on the northern plains is brutal. Blizzards don't care what uniform you're wearing.
No, they certainly don't.
So wasn't pushing a campaign into the dead of winter just as deadly for the U.S. soldiers?
Well, the toll on the soldiers was absolutely horrific, and the military records from this period, they don't hide that at all. For example, the sources detailed General George Crook's expedition in the late summer and fall of 1876.
Right, this is the one that became infamous as the Horsemeat March, I think, or the Mud March.
Yes. Crook pushed his men through the Dakota Badlands in just torrential rain and freezing mud, and their supply lines completely collapsed.
They literally ran out of food.
They ran out of rations and were reduced to slaughtering and eating their own cavalry horses just to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Men were sick, wounded, and starving in the mud.
So, I mean, both sides are freezing and both sides are facing starvation. It sounds like a horrific stalemate.
It would be, except for one critical difference.
Yeah.
The U.S. Army had an industrial supply chain backing them up. Consider the steamboats. The military utilized riverboats like the Far West. That single boat could navigate the river systems and deliver 200 tons of supplies from Fort Abraham Lincoln directly to military depots.
200 tons, wow.
And they had massive wagon trains, too, each pulled by 6 mules, carrying thousands of pounds of forage for the horses, winter clothing, and rations.
Meaning If a U.S. Army unit was battered by the winter like Crook's men were, they could eventually rotate out, retreat to a fortified position, and be entirely resupplied.
Exactly. Fresh men, fresh horses, and new ammunition.
So the industrial capacity of the United States meant the military could absorb the punishment of the winter, whereas the Lakota and Cheyenne families, who relied entirely on their immediate environment for survival, just could not.
Right, because the military kept the pressure on, those families couldn't just settle into a valley and hunt.
They were burdened by the constant daily necessity of protecting their elders and children while on the run. And that vulnerability is exactly what Colonel Randall Mackenzie exploited in a really deeply unsettling way in November of 1876.
Yeah, this is a very critical moment. 5 months after Little Bighorn, on November 25th, Mackenzie leads a force of about 1,100 men and attacks the Northern Cheyenne village of Chief Dull Knife on the Red Fork of the Powder River.
And they hit them right at dawn.
Yes, and it's crucial that we look at this not just as, like, a shootout, but as a calculated tactic of economic destruction. Mackenzie's troops drove the Cheyenne out of their camp and into the surrounding bluffs.
And about 40 Cheyenne were killed in the initial fighting, right?
Yeah, about 40. But the real devastation, the part that fundamentally altered the war, was what the soldiers did once they actually controlled the village.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. They systematically burned everything to the ground.
Everything.
They burned the tippas, they burned the buffalo robes and the heavy winter clothing, they burned all the critical winter food supplies.
Tons of dried meat and berries.
Stuff that the Cheyenne women had spent the entire summer and fall painstakingly preparing and storing. And on top of that, they captured or just scattered the pony herds.
I mean, imagine the psychological and physical impact of that. The survivors are up in the freezing bluffs watching their entire economy, their shelter, and their food supply literally go up in smoke.
It was an environmental siege. Instead of surrounding a stone castle to starve out an army, the military effectively burned down the supply lines, the physical homes and the food source, and just let the brutal plains winter do the work of a siege wall.
Exactly.
It's like having your house and your grocery store burned down while you were stranded in Antarctica. You were in a frozen wilderness with literally nothing but the clothes on your back.
That is the grim reality of this strategy. That night, the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero.
God.
And the historical sources note a deeply tragic consequence of this attack. 11 babies froze to death at their mother's breasts.
That's just, I can't even fathom that.
It's horrifying. The survivors, many of whom lacked moccasins or winter coats, had to make a desperate, agonizing trek across the freezing mountains just to reach Crazy Horse's camp for refuge.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when you look at the sheer human cost of an event like the destruction at the Red Fork, it really shifts your perspective on the military strategy.
It has to, yeah.
Women, children, elders, and the basic materials of shelter and food, they were not background casualties. They were deliberately made the central targets of the campaign. The objective was to break the tribe's independence by destroying their ability to simply exist in that landscape.
Right. And that relentless pressure didn't pause for the weather. The U.S. Army pushed right through the dead of winter into January 1877, which leads us to the Battle of Wolf Mountain on January 8th.
Where Colonel Nelson Miles, commanding about 300 infantrymen, clashes with Crazy Horse and his followers.
Yes.
I really want to focus on the conditions of this battle, because the environment itself was the primary enemy here. They are fighting in a sub-zero blizzard.
The snow is up to their thighs.
Up to their thighs. And Miles's men are actually using artillery-like, a disguised cannon firing blindly into the driving snow.
It is a chaotic, freezing, miserable engagement for everyone involved. Ultimately, Crazy Horse and his warriors withdrew up the valley.
So nobody was completely wiped out on the battlefield, making it tactically, basically, inconclusive. Why, then, do military historians consider the strategic effect of Wolf Mountain to be so devastating for the Lakota and Cheyenne?
Because it proved a terrifying reality. There was absolutely no safe haven left, even in the middle of January in a blinding blizzard in the most remote valleys of the Montana Territory.
The soldiers would still find you.
Exactly. There was no time to rest, no time to mend lodges, and no time to forage. The psychological toll of knowing you were being hunted without pause, combined with the physical toll of the winter, was just breaking their endurance.
And their economy was simultaneously being strangled from the outside. The agency records from this period paint a really bleak picture of how this economic strangulation actually worked.
Yeah, and when we say agencies, we are talking about U.S. government-run outposts.
Right, essentially rudimentary reservations and distribution hubs where the government controlled the flow of food, goods, and annuities that were promised by treaty.
These agencies were the primary interface between the U.S. government and the native populations, and during this time, they became a tool of war.
Exactly. Native hunters couldn't procure enough food out on the plains for two compounding reasons. First, the buffalo hunting failed that year. Because they were constantly fleeing cavalry columns, they couldn't travel to where the herds were.
No time to track them.
Right, and they certainly couldn't set up the massive, time-intensive processing camps required to butcher and preserve thousands of pounds of meat.
And second, they were running completely out of ammunition, which was a deliberate U.S. policy.
Right, the agency reports note how heavily the native people relied on trading buffalo hinds for bullets. There's a specific report detailing a trader who was paying 50 cartridges for $2.50 worth of hides.
That was how the plains economy functioned at this point.
But then, under military orders, the agency stopped the sale of arms and ammunition entirely. They completely cut off the supply. So how do you even fight back when you can't even buy the bullets to hunt for your dinner, let alone defend your camp?
You can't. The lack of ammunition directly translates to a lack of calories and a lack of warmth.
Wow, yeah.
If you don't have bullets, you have to hunt buffalo with arrows or lances. That requires getting much closer to the herd, expending vastly more energy, and it is far less efficient.
And without efficient hunting, you have no meat to eat.
Without meat, you have no fresh hides. Without hides, you can't repair your damaged tippus or replace the winter robes that Mackenzie burned at the Red Fork.
It's a cascading failure of their life support system. The U.S. military's deliberate pressure magnified the natural disasters of cold and hunger. They essentially weaponized the winter ecosystem itself.
They absolutely did, and the cumulative weight of that weaponization becomes undeniable as we move into the spring of 1877.
You have families who are freezing, starving, constantly looking over their shoulders with no bullets and no safe place to sleep. It's no wonder that just a few months after Wolf Mountain, the resolve to stay out on the plains began to break.
Right. Thousands of Lakota and Cheyenne, entirely wearied by this constant pressure, began returning to the government agencies to surrender.
When you read the dispatches from the government agents on the ground, you get a really visceral sense of the toll this strategy took. There is a documentary climax in our sources that perfectly illustrates this, a report from a man named J.M. Lee.
Ah, yes. At the Spotted Tail Agency.
Exactly, dated May 1st, 1877. Lee explicitly describes the physical condition of the people returning from the North. He doesn't describe proud warriors coming in to negotiate. He describes people who were utterly destitute.
They were crowded into damaged, tattered lodges.
They were physically broken from starvation because the buffalo hunt had failed, and they had no ammunition to feed themselves.
It is a portrait of complete exhaustion. The independent, self-sustaining society that had triumphed at Little Bighorn had been methodically dismantled.
Which brings us to the surrender of Crazy Horse himself. On May 6th and 7th of 1877, so less than a year after his victory at Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse arrives at Fort Robinson, Nebraska.
And he brings in roughly 1,100 of his followers to surrender to the U.S. authorities.
And I think it is so critical that we don't romanticize this moment or fundamentally misunderstand the historical reality of it.
What is the misconception you often see there?
Well, sometimes history frames surrenders as a moral conversion or like a realization by the defeated party that the opposing army was somehow inherently better or culturally superior.
Right.
That is absolutely not what happened at Fort Robinson. This was a desperate, pragmatic choice by a leader who was simply trying to keep his people from starving to death. They were out of food, they were out of bullets, and they were out of options. Submitting to the agency was literally the only way to ensure the children and elders survived another week.
That is a crucial distinction. It was a surrender to logistics, not to ideology.
Exactly.
And this raises an important question because while thousands did make that agonizing choice to surrender to save their families, not everyone submitted.
Right. Sitting Bull took a completely different path.
He did. Sitting Bull and some 5,000 of his Lakota followers refused to submit to the agency's and the U.S. military's terms. Instead, they made a massive, logistically incredibly difficult trek north, crossing the international border into Canada.
Or what the military reports at the time referred to as the British possessions.
Right.
And crossing that border
Yeah.
completely neutralized the U.S. Army's strategy, didn't it?
Entirely. The U.S. military could not simply march into Canada and start burning villages without sparking an international incident with the British Empire.
That makes sense.
Sitting Bull used the geopolitical boundary as a shield, and his defiance was absolute. When U.S. General Alfred Terry later traveled up to Canada to try and negotiate a return and surrender, Sitting Bull told the U.S. commissioners straight out that the land belonged to the native people, not the Americans.
Wow.
He chose the incredible hardship of exile over submission to the agencies.
But for those who stayed, for Crazy Horse, for Dull Knife, and for the thousands of people who surrendered at the agencies in the spring of 1877, the independent, nomadic life they had fought so fiercely to defend at Little Bighorn was effectively over.
It was over in less than 12 months. The speed of that transition is staggering.
So what does this all mean? When you look at this rapid timeline, moving from the heights of a massive summer victory to the utter devastation of the starving winter, it forces you to completely rethink how the United States actually won this war.
The final historical judgment of this era is that the United States Army did not erase the defeat of Little Bighorn with a grand set-piece battle. There was no single, glorious cavalry charge where they proved their tactical superiority over the Lakota and Cheyenne.
Right, because that's not how it happened.
Exactly. Instead, the military made continued independent life increasingly impossible for the families who had won there. They systematically dismantled their ability to survive the winter by targeting the foundation of their existence: the food, the shelter, the horses, and the ammunition.
They didn't just defeat an army. They dismantled an ecosystem. And that leaves you with a really profound thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
You know, history loves to focus on the glory of summer battles.
Always.
We memorize the names of the generals, the brilliant flanking maneuvers, the dramatic last stands. But the true fate of nations is so often decided by logistics, by supply lines, and by who controls the food and the warmth when the brutal winter sets in.
Yeah.
Does true defeat happen in the chaos of the battlefield? Or does it happen when the very environment you rely on is turned into a weapon against you?
It's a very sobering perspective on the real mechanics of conflict and survival.
It really is. Well, thank you for joining us in the third chair today for this deep dive into a really heavy but incredibly important piece of history.
Yes, thank you for listening.
If this exploration gave you a new perspective, please remember to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives. Take care, keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.